Thank you for joining us. Coming up on the show, lots of news and safety tips, including this sad story from Icon Aircraft, maker of the A-5 amphibious seaplane. They had their first fatal accident this week, which killed 2 employees. And it happened on a lake where I've landed my seaplane numerous times. We'll talk about the hazards at that lake. And a skydiver in Europe dangles from a Cessna 182 for over an hour before the pilot finally has to land with him in tow. The FAA has issued a warning about using checklist. Also, FAA data shows that airline-ready U.S. pilot numbers are tumbling. And a 2-seat general aviation aircraft made its first flight using solar power. Plus, I'll give an update on my trip flying a twin-diamond DA42 from California to Texas last week. And I'll talk about how I spent last weekend in a Cirrus Vision jet. Boy, was that fun. Plus, listener mail, including an airline pilot who responded with his tips to my earlier episode on nailing the airspeed on final using power and pitch. All this and more, and the news starts now. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Truscott, and I'm here to share my over 40 years of experience as a licensed pilot as we talk about news and safety tips to help you fly safely. And here's how you can help. If you like the show, please tell all of your friends. And special thanks to the 6 people who left iTunes reviews last week. I picked one review, which I'll read at the end of the show. From NBCBayArea.com, 2 men died aboard a small plane that crashed in Lake Berryessa on Monday morning. The FAA said that the aircraft was a single-engine Icon A-5, which crashed under unknown circumstances. Now, this is the first fatal crash of the Icon A-5. This is a very well-publicized startup company founded by Kirk Hawkins, who is a Stanford graduate, and it's well-backed by a venture capitalist here in Silicon Valley. The company's factory is in Vacaville, which is in the northern portion of the San Francisco Bay Area, and a lot of their test flights and training are done on Lake Berryessa, which is perhaps 20 miles away. Now, I've landed on Lake Berryessa many times in the past. I have a lake amphibian seaplane, and there are designated seaplane landing lanes up in the northern two-thirds of the lake. For reasons that are unknown, this crash occurred toward the southern end of the lake, an area which is fairly narrow and which has a number of obstructions, including wires that cross the water at low altitudes. The 2 men killed included the chief test pilot for Icon as well as a new employee. The aircraft had only been in the air about 20 minutes at the time that the crash occurred. According to NTSB investigator Joshua Kothra, we don't have any known witnesses at this point in time to the accident sequence itself. He says we are looking for witnesses. I've seen photos of the crash from several different angles, and it's directly on the shoreline, so it appears that it must have been some type of either takeoff or landing accident where they may have run out of water or hit some object which diverted them toward the shore. The aircraft is substantially broken up, presumably because that part of the shoreline is relatively steep, so the airplane probably came to a very abrupt halt as it hit the shoreline. Now, as I mentioned before, that part of the lake is fairly narrow and has a number of different obstacles. Some of the possible things come to mind would be wires, so we've heard that the aircraft did not hit wires. Could have been submerged logs or even a glassy water landing. The winds were relatively calm at that point in time, and the lake is very well shielded by high hills, so it's possible for the water to be glassy, which makes it very difficult for seaplane pilots to judge their height above the water. Our heart and prayers go out to the family. This really is quite a tragedy for everyone involved. And just a quick update, after I recorded this initial session and before I published the show, avweb.com came out with an update in which apparently a witness has been located to the crash. According to Peter Knudsen, public affairs officer with the NTSB, a witness saw the aircraft flying 30 to 50 feet above the water. The plane then turned into a cove, applied full power, pitched up, and rolled to the left. The aircraft went out of the witness's line of sight shortly before impact with the terrain. NTSB also confirmed that there was no post-crash fire. The Icon A-5 is equipped with a flight data recorder, which was recovered, and the NTSB is attempting to download the data in support of its analysis. In other news from Flying Magazine, a long-term collaboration has been announced between Jeppesen and Preflight, which is going to bring many Preflight features to Jeppesen's Flight Deck Pro and bring JEP charts and data to Preflight. According to Tyson Weiss, Preflight co-founder and CEO, quote, "For years we've heard pilots ask, when can I get Jeppesen navigation data and charts in Preflight? And today we're pleased to announce that's coming." Pricing for Preflight mobile app starts at $99 per year. Adding Jeppesen charts to Preflight for the continental U.S. will add $199 to the yearly subscription price. From AOPA, a $1 trillion omnibus spending bill that will keep the U.S. government running through September has been signed by the president, with the FAA programs most important to general aviation fully funded. The bill provides $16.4 billion in total resources to the FAA, which is $127 million above the level enacted for fiscal 2016 and $508 million above the amount requested for fiscal year 2017. Highlights of the appropriation include full funding for all air traffic control personnel, full funding of the contract tower program, alternate GA fuels research at $7 million, an increase over the fiscal budget 2017 request of $5.7 million, and more than $1 billion for the Next Generation Air Transportation System, NextGen, to help ease future congestion and reduce delays for travelers. System-wide implementation of ADS-B was funded at $154 million, well above the fiscal 2017 request of $31 million. And if you fly GPS approaches, you'll be happy to know that the Wide Area Augmentation System, which is used to provide WASP-based GPS approaches, received $111 million, which was well beyond its $85 million funding request. And integration of unmanned aircraft systems, otherwise known as drones, was funded at more than $40 million beyond their requested sum. And according to General Aviation News, pilots are flocking to Basic Med. On May 1st, the first day pilots could fly under the new Basic Med rules. Over 1,300 pilots had already successfully completed the self-assessment checklist, physical examination with a state licensed physician, and the AOPA free online medical self-assessment course. So they were all ready to fly with Basic Med. According to Mark Baker, AOPA president, AOPA has fought for years for medical reform. We are happy that so many pilots are ready to fly under Basic Med on day one. AOPA has developed Fit to Fly, a series of resources to help pilots understand Basic Med, which includes a pilot and physician's guide, an FAQ, video, and more. From Flying Magazine, designated pilot examiner Jason Blair writes that the FAA data shows that the number of ATP practical tests being administered in the United States is declining, following 2 years of declining numbers of applicants for the ATP knowledge exam. Now, ATP numbers peaked in 2016 at over 8,000 certificates being issued, but in the current month, the number is expected to reach only 3,300. Additionally, the overall number of pilots earning commercial multi-engine certificates has remained flat, while the percentage of those tests being completed by U.S. pilots has declined significantly. Blair writes that in 2007, fully two-thirds of all commercial multi-engine certificates went to U.S. citizens, but by the end of last year, U.S. citizens earned slightly less than half of all multi-engine commercial certificates issued here in the U.S. While the number of non-U.S. pilots training in flight schools here is increasing, most non-U.S. pilot graduates eventually leave for cockpit careers in other parts of the world, making them unavailable to fill U.S. commercial pilot positions. Blair says if this trend continues, we're going to have fewer U.S. commercial qualified pilots, and the overall number available for airline employment will decline. He says that the shortage of pilots is likely to occur in the future. From Flying Magazine, the U.S. Court of Appeals has referred a controversial agreement between the FAA and the City of Santa Monica to close Santa Monica Airport to a merits panel for further review regarding the legality of the settlement agreement. The ruling defers the FAA's motion for dismissal of review, which was made earlier this year by the NBAA. The FAA agreement with the city calls for the airport to be closed by December of 2028, and the city also gained the right to shorten Santa Monica's runway from 4,900 feet to 3,500 feet, which would prevent most jets from using the airport. Now, back in February, NBAA argued that the FAA failed to follow established procedures when issuing the settlement order, including consideration of its detrimental effects to operators and businesses at the airport and to the national airspace system. Then, in March, NBAA requested a stay to stop the city from shortening SMO's runway while the court reviewed the settlement agreement. Though the court denied NBAA's request for a stay and an injunction to keep the city from shortening the runway, the court order refers the case to the merits panel for further review. And from the FAA comes this safety alert for operators concerning commercial off-the-shelf checklists, which they call COTS, or personally developed checklist. The background is that recently a pilot was unable to lower the aircraft's landing gear, and he referred to one of these checklists for a specific type of aircraft. The aircraft landed with the landing gear partially extended, and on contact with the runway, the landing gear collapsed and the aircraft sustained substantial damage. The post-accident investigation compared the POH and the COTS checklist, and the investigation found that the COTS checklist did not match. Omissions of steps included items which significantly contributed to the pilot's inability to fully extend the aircraft's landing gear. So the recommended action from the FAA is that people who choose to use COTS or personally developed checklists should meticulously compare them to the manufacturer's checklist and placards contained in the POH to confirm that they are identical. Turning now to international news, and we have several different stories. From Switzerland, according to designboom.com, comes word of the first flight of a solar-powered airplane. Now, this is from Solar Stratus. It's going to be the first commercial two-seat solar plane in history that will be able to fly up to the stratosphere. According to the designer Kalin Gulagong, the aircraft should be able to fly to 25,000 meters, which is over 82,000 feet. He says it opens a window to electric and solar-powered high-altitude aviation, something that has never before been attempted. He says, "We were impatient for this moment and are happy with our first flight. Now we must continue to work hard to learn how to harness the potential of this solar-powered treasure. We want to demonstrate that with current technology, it's possible to go beyond what fossil fuels offer." And just to give you an idea of what this aircraft looks like, the wings are completely covered with solar cells. It's got a wingspan of about 24 meters, which is almost 80 feet long, so a pretty wide wingspan there, much like a glider. It weighs 450 kilograms, which translates to about 990 pounds. And the wings, the solar panels cover 22 square meters, or about 236 square feet. The company says that since the aircraft is propelled solely by solar energy without any pollutant emissions, it gives them the possibility of making new measurements at a high altitude that have never been done before. And could general aviation finally be getting ready to take off in China? From Air and Space magazine, Chinese general aviation advocates sought advice and inspiration at a recent meeting in Chino, California. They say the Chinese government is rewriting rules for private pilots after the State Council recently announced that general aviation will be the next big driver of China's economy. Last year, the Civil Aviation Administration of China, or CAAC, earmarked nearly $12 billion for 11 large airport construction projects and 52 upgrades to existing facilities. The country also plans to build 500 new general aviation airports by 2020. By that time, they say 5,000 GA aircraft are expected to be flying in China compared to fewer than 2,000 aircraft today. In addition, the CAAC has removed some of the barriers facing private pilots by opening up airspace below 1,000 meters, about 3,000 feet, at least in test cities, to allow non-commercial flying without restrictive flight plans. The agency will gradually raise the threshold to 3,000 meters. The speakers included Bradley Harker, who's in charge of aviation and other transportation relationships at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. According to him, quote, "There's a tremendous pent-up demand for general aviation in China." He said the general aviation market is so massive it could amount to $40 billion or more. And finally, from Denmark comes this story from the New York Post. A skydiver in Denmark is lucky to be alive after getting entangled beneath a single-engine plane at 8,200 feet. He dangled for an hour before the craft safely landed in a field that had been padded with foam. Now, the skydive occurred at an airfield near Holstebro, which is about 200 miles northwest of Copenhagen. And they say it took a dramatic turn for the worse when the 45-year-old skydiver's foot somehow got caught in a cable beneath the Cessna 182. As soon as his instructor, who jumped before him, was able to get radio contact with the pilot and people on the ground, a rescue operation was started. At that point, the aircraft was down to a height of about 1,600 feet, but went back up to around 3,200 feet in case the skydiver came loose and needed to use his parachute. They said the plane then circled for about an hour to burn fuel as emergency responders followed in a helicopter until the skydiver signaled that he was ready to land. The pilot, Leif Johansson, coordinated with people on the ground to spread out foam padding on the landing area so the impact would be softened as much as possible. After the landing, the skydiver, who was dragged more than 600 feet along the airfield, sustained only minor injuries. The pilot said, "On the way down, I was thinking whether I was about to kill a man," he told TV reporters. "What will happen? There was only one method left, and that was to try and land with him." Johansson, who has nearly 4 decades of experience as a pilot, said that he didn't even realize the skydiver was entangled until being alerted by ground officials. Well, we're happy that turned out well for both the pilot and especially for the skydiver. Well, there you have it. That's the news for this week. Coming up in a moment, details on my trip from California to Texas in a Diamond DA42. And a listener asked a question on picking up IFR clearances in the air. We'll be right back. Welcome back. And before I get to the trip to Texas, let me share this with you. Last week, I was interviewed on the Flying and Life podcast by dispatcher Mike. Now, Mike is a dispatcher for a major legacy airline in the U.S., and I had him on the show recently as he talked about how his airline uses Part 135 charter operators to move mostly parts around the country to get grounded airliners back in the air. And on his most recent episode, he interviewed me about flight instruction as a career. Here's a brief segment.
For you as a flight instructor, what is your biggest reward or biggest challenge when it comes to students?
Well, the reward is easy. The reward is just sharing in their success. Every time somebody solos, I'm almost as excited, as they are. Not quite. I mean, it would be hard to be that excited. But I really enjoy helping people achieve their goals. And if you'd like to hear the rest of the interview, go to the Flying and Life podcast. And thanks again to Dispatcher Mike for having me on the show. A couple of quick announcements here. If you are in the Mountain View, California area and are planning to attend Accident Wise 2017 on Thursday, May the 11th, that's a really large safety seminar, one of the largest in the country. We typically have about 250 attendees. This year, unbeknownst to us when we sent out the mailing, the Moffett Boulevard entrance to Moffett Field is closed. They're doing a reconstruction there. So if you're coming to this, make sure you go one exit further south and get off on the Ellis Street exit and come into Moffett Field at the Ellis Gate. Should be a fun show. We've got a couple of people in from Washington talking about Basic Med, one of the people who helped write those regulations, talking about the new commercial ACS. For those of you becoming commercial pilots, you'll be interested in knowing about those changes, as well as talking about non-towered airports. An AOPA presenter will be there talking about that. Should be a fun evening. Also, a silent auction for a Lightspeed Zulu 3 headset. We want to thank Lightspeed for donating that. And I just want to give you a quick update. This past weekend, I was in Knoxville, Tennessee. I spent a fair amount of time in the Cirrus jet, recorded some interviews with people about the jet. So stick around for an upcoming episode where I will talk in more detail about that amazing aircraft. Boy, did I have fun in Knoxville, Tennessee. And this is the part of the show where I talk briefly about my online courses. If you go out to pilotlearning.com, we've got courses on the G1000, both for VFR and IFR operation of the aircraft. And we've got a GPS and WAS course for those of you flying the latest fancy GPS approaches using WAS, the Wide Area Augmentation System. Courses range from $59 to $79, or you can take all the courses for just one monthly membership of $29.95. You can also sign up for an entire year for $2.99, which is the same as getting 2 free months. And if you do sign up for the full year, you'll get a 1.5 hour consulting call with me for free, included with that for any topic you would like to discuss. Okay, let's get on to that trip now, taking the Diamond DA42 to Texas. Now, 2 episodes ago, I talked about all the flight planning that I did ahead of time to try and figure out what we needed to do for that particular trip. Hope you enjoyed that show. Here are the results. The following morning on Friday, I went to the airport. We loaded the aircraft. We were all ready to go, and we decided to postpone the trip, but I'm still going to tell you about it. And the reason is, as we looked at the route, we knew that we were going to have probably moderate turbulence along much of the route. However, there was an airmet for severe turbulence over the high desert of California in an area that we were going to have to go through. There were all kinds of PIREPs from airliners, A320s, things like that, talking about significant turbulence in that area. So that route really didn't look very attractive to us. So on the fly, we started looking at another route that would have taken us further north, track through essentially Reno, Nevada, and then up through Salt Lake City, and then cross into Wyoming, and then come down through the eastern portion of Colorado to get to Texas. Well, turns out that there was a lot of freezing rain along that route, about 700 miles of it. Well, I say freezing rain, actually it was icing along that route. Now, we did have a Fiki-equipped aircraft, and it could certainly fly through some amount of ice for some period of time, but 700 miles seemed a little daunting, so we postponed the trip till Monday. Well, what that meant was I instead picked up an SR-20 over the weekend before the trip to Texas. So let me tell you about that briefly. The owner purchased an SR-20 2004, which had the most amazing design I have ever seen. Most of these older Cirruses are white. This one was covered with bright orange decals, and it was really quite eye-catching and quite a spectacular appearance to the aircraft, one which I had never really seen the likes of on a Cirrus before. So I flew on Southwest down to Phoenix, where I picked up a shuttle to Prescott, and that, by the way, turned out to be much better than renting a car, $37 to let somebody else do the driving for about an hour and 45 minutes. Got to the hotel the night before, which, by the way, I always recommend that. If you're going to have to move an airplane, get on the night before so you get a nice early start the next day, especially if you're flying in places like Phoenix and New Mexico, where you've got a fair amount of turbulence once things warm up past the mid to late morning. Now, I always prefer to have the owner arrive ahead of time, just because there's always something that seems to need some attention. In this case, the owner arrived about the same time I did, and sure enough, it did take us a little extra time the next morning to get out, just because of some of the things that we still needed to do. Now, when we first arrived at the airport, the Uber driver dropped us off at the commercial terminal, and it hadn't occurred to me until I walked in the front door and saw a TSA agent that we were in the wrong place. So we quickly ran back outside, grabbed the Uber driver, who drove us around to the other side of the field, which was the GA side. Now, the first issue we encountered was trying to find a key. The owner was given a key at the FBO. We opened up the aircraft, and the other key we searched and searched and searched for, and finally we found that it was attached to the parachute pin, which is up in the ceiling of the aircraft. So that gave us both the baggage key and the outside door key, as well as the ignition key. Well, we filled the aircraft, and then when I checked the oil, I was shocked. It had only about perhaps 3.5 quarts. It took us over 3 quarts to bring it up over 6 quarts. Now, that's the lowest amount of oil I've ever seen in an aircraft in my 40 plus years of flying. So I have to say that whoever ferried that aircraft there really didn't do a good job of pre-flighting it. We also did a very thorough inspection. We found that the Garmin database was out of date, but that wasn't a big deal because we were flying VFR back to California. We took time and care to locate the POH and all the required documents, the airworthiness certificate and the registration. And now these are all things that could have been done ahead of time and would have saved a little bit of time. And then we did find that there were a couple places in the aircraft that needed a little bit of paint. And that's important because the composite materials that these aircraft are built out of should not be exposed to the sunlight, because over time it's going to, the UV radiation from the sun is going to harm those composites, which is why they need to be painted and covered in all areas. Now, the really big shock that we found was that one of the 5 fuel drains on this aircraft was frozen shut. In fact, it was just covered with all kinds of dark material, and it was real obvious that the prior owner was totally unaware of the existence of that drain, had never used it for the 2+ years that he owned the aircraft. Now, this is the drain that's underneath the fuselage. And so, to me, that just kind of goes back to the issue of people getting poor instruction when they buy aircraft like this. A lot of people, unfortunately, will use their friend CFI to check them out on the aircraft, the person that they, flew with when they got their private, someone who often doesn't know a lot of the details of these kinds of aircraft. So anyway, it just doesn't really pay to have someone check you out in an aircraft when they know very little more about the airplane than you do. And to me, this was just a, prime example of this. Now, I cautioned the owner once we found that the drain was shut, not to push any harder on it to try and open it up, because my concern was it might pop open and stay open since it was obviously corroded a little bit. Well, so that was the big surprise that we found. The best news is the flight home, we had no surprises, and that really is great. So we flew the aircraft lean of peak on the way home, and so that resulted in a fuel burn of about 9 gallons per hour on this 200 horsepower engine. That gave us about 139 knots at 10,500 feet. Now, the club in which this aircraft is going to be leased requires that owners fly the Cirrus and most other aircraft rich of peak, which would be a higher fuel flow. But in this case, it was the owner flying the aircraft, and of course the owner can fly it whichever way they choose, either rich of peak or lean of peak. Now, the one big caution in these aircraft, if you're going to fly them lean of peak, the maximum power that's allowed is 65%. But here's the real benefit. Since we were only burning 9 gallons an hour, we saved a fuel stop, which saved an hour. Otherwise, if we'd been burning 12 plus gallons an hour, we wouldn't have made it all the way home on a single tank of gas. So that was a huge benefit. Now, the other interesting thing about this aircraft is it's the only one I've ever seen that didn't have dual Garmin 430s in an Avidyne SR20 or SR22. Instead, it had one Garmin 430 for GPS 1, and it had a Garmin 250 XL, which is a VFR-only GPS for the number 2 common GPS. The downside of this turns out to be that there is no crossfill capability, so you can't copy a flight plan from one GPS to the other. Also, interestingly, most of these Avidynes are set up so that even if the autopilot is tracking the GPS output, you can still change the HSI to something other than the GPS. Well, it turns out you couldn't do this in this particular aircraft. Well, whatever you have set in the HSI is the only thing that you can use the autopilot to track in the nav mode. So that was trip number 1. And got back on Sunday and then promptly got up early Monday morning to, guess what? Go to Texas in the Diamond DA42. And what a great thing it was that we waited, because on Monday the weather was spectacular as compared to pretty bad weather on Friday. So the trip started with a really nice tailwind, which was great because that assured us that we made it to our first stop in Prescott, Arizona. So that turned out to be the second time I was going to be in Prescott in 2 days. Now, the reason I chose Prescott as I was headed eastbound to Texas was the airport's located at 5,000 feet. Now, the benefit of that is if you're cruising along at maybe 9,000 feet, you only need to descend 4,000 feet to land and then only climb 4,000 feet to get back up when you depart. And that saves a tremendous amount of time and fuel, as contrasted with, for example, we could have landed at an airport near, for example, Lake Havasu. Those airports are going to be down substantially closer to sea level. So you're going to spend a lot of time going down that last 5,000 feet that you don't need to. Now, from Prescott, we were fairly confident that we could make it all the way to Denton, Texas in just one stop. And if we weren't able to do it, we were going to stop at Lubbock, Texas, which is right along the route. In fact, we flew directly over Lubbock. So we had a really great tailwind on the first leg. In fact, it was so strong that initially I went ahead and ran the Diamond DA42 at 60% power just to save gas while we had those strong winds, so that we would guarantee that we'd absolutely have enough fuel to get to Prescott. Because if we didn't get there, well, there was a little chance that we'd make it to Denton non-stop, and we would have had to have 2 fuel stops instead of 1. So as I went southeast through California, I was really careful when I went through the Tehachapi's. These are the mountains that are just south of Bakersfield. They divide the Central Valley of California from the high desert and from Southern California below it. And I asked for ride reports as we were going through before crossing. And the reason is I really got clobbered there about this time a year ago by severe turbulence in that area. So this time we climbed a little bit higher. We slowed up a little bit before we went through, and things were just fine. This was also about the time when we transferred fuel from the aux tanks into the mains. And the reason we have to be careful about doing that is that the fuel to the engines on this Diamond DA42 Twin Star come from the wing tanks only. And so in order to use the fuel from the aux tanks, you have to first burn off about half the fuel in the main tanks to create space in them so that you can then transfer the fuel from the aux tanks into the mains. Now, if you weren't to do that first, you would essentially be pumping fuel overboard as you try to transfer fuel from the aux tanks into the two full main tanks. Now, we had great cell phone coverage all the way to Prescott, at least for SMS, which is text. So we did a fair amount of texting along the way, which was kind of fun. And I did a Facebook live video as we were close to Edwards Air Force Base because we had the LTE connection on my cell phone. And that was kind of fun to share with people in real live time what we were doing as we were flying by. So tweeting and occasionally doing videos can definitely make the trip go by faster. Well, we arrived at Prescott by about 11:30. It took about an hour, almost as it always does. I always figure a fuel stop is an hour. And if you think you can do it faster than that, then you're probably not counting the time it takes to descend from altitude, land at the airport, and then the time it takes to climb back up to altitude. You may stay on the ground only for 40 minutes, but you probably lost another 20 minutes getting from cruise altitude down to the airport and then back up again. Well, the funny thing is when we landed at the airport and went to the FBO, the lineman recognized me and said, "Welcome back," because we'd purchased gas from him the day before in the SR-20 that I was just telling you about. Well, departing Prescott, it was warmer, so the climb rate was slower, even though we have turbocharged engines in that aircraft. We started climbing initially to 9,500 since we were eastbound, but we didn't stay there long. We continued on up to 11,500 feet, just so that we would have greater clearance above the terrain and also to try and minimize the turbulence. And throughout the first half of the trip, we probably had a 15 to 20 knot tailwind. So when we were at 75% power, that gave us about 154 knots. And so we were consistently above about 170 knots for at least the first half of the trip. Now, we didn't have quite the winds that good as we left at Prescott. But on that second leg, almost immediately we spotted smoke from a fire, and that smoke went all the way up to 11,500. So we had to deviate to the south to get around the smoke. You certainly don't want to fly through forest fire smoke because that's going to be smelly and probably not particularly good for the engines. And the other thing that happened is we lost our great cell phone coverage until we made it all the way to Albuquerque, which, by the way, is a long ways. From Prescott to almost the Texas border is desert. And frankly, there were a lot of places there where if we had to put it down, there wouldn't have been a good place to put the aircraft down on the ground. So I certainly miss having a parachute like in the Cirrus in those particular cases. But what I do to try and mitigate that additional risk is make sure that the nearest page is up at all times. So we constantly have an update as to, what direction we would fly and how many miles it would take to get to the nearest airport. And by the way, I did get a little bit bored on that stretch of the trip. So I used the G1000 to measure the width of New Mexico at that point. Turned out that New Mexico is 298 nautical miles wide, which tells you, it's about 2 hours to cross it. And that could be a long time when you're bouncing along in light turbulence. But speaking of turbulence, I figured out a good way to use the autopilot to help smooth out the ride a little bit. I'd heard about this before for severe turbulence, but this was the first time I'd ever used it to kind of mitigate what I would call light turbulence or maybe very moderate turbulence. Normally, I'm flying on trips, I would have the autopilot set up in altitude hold mode and in nav mode. So we're staying at a constant altitude and we're tracking a course to our destination. Well, what I did instead was, instead of being in altitude hold mode, I put it in vertical speed mode, but I selected 0 feet per minute. So we're neither climbing nor descending. And what that means is when we get bumps, as we get kind of tossed up a little or tossed down a little bit, the autopilot doesn't fight to try and go against the turbulence to get the aircraft immediately back to where it was before it got bumped off its altitude. Now, prior to doing that, I was making frequent changes to the throttle. So, for example, when we had an updraft and the aircraft started to pitch down and accelerate, I would pull the throttle back a little bit so that we wouldn't be going too fast if we hit a bump. And then as we would get, wind moving in the opposite direction, then I would add the power back in as the aircraft was slowing a little bit. What I found is once I put it into the vertical speed mode with 0 feet per minute, I could actually run the aircraft at its full cruise power of 75%. I never had to adjust the throttle, and the ride was actually smoother than it was before. So this was a big aha to me. I took it one step further. Instead of having it in nav mode, I put it in roll mode, which basically means keep the wings level. Now, I did probably every 10, 15 minutes have to readjust the heading of the aircraft, because in roll mode, it won't hold a heading. It will over time deviate. But wow, talk about a way to smooth the bumps out to make the ride more comfortable. Now, if you were in the Cirrus perspective, you could just use the blue button, which is the level key, which would do essentially the same thing. Now, the level key is a really, really great feature, though it only works up to about 60 degrees of bank. So if you're in a really unusual attitude beyond 60 degrees of bank, it's not going to save you. You have to be within kind of the normal range for autopilot engagement. But basically, the level key will take you from just about any unusual attitude and level you out. So it takes probably about 6 seconds for it to do that. And now the new mantra for people is before you pull the parachute, press that level key first to see if that saves you. Well, as we continued east and got close to the Texas border, we lost all of that desert, and the terrain started to drop away and become farmland, which was really welcome because now it looked like a better chance of surviving an off-airport landing. But we didn't descend immediately. We started down in 1,000-foot increments, mainly because I wanted to have thicker air, more oxygen available, but I didn't want to descend down into the turbulence that was forecasted for the end of the trip. Now, normally you would think that you would have to drop by 2,000 feet to obey the hemispheric rule. But what I found in the Southwest, where things are turbulent and where there are relatively few airplanes flying, ATC is pretty accommodating about letting you fly whatever altitude you would like to fly. It's pretty rare in that part of the world that they force you to fly the standard recommended altitudes, particularly if you have a good reason. As we got closer to Denton, Texas, we went ahead and used the VNAV function of the G1000 for descent planning. Essentially, what we programmed it to do was to get the aircraft down to pattern altitude 3 miles before we reached the field. Now, in high-performance aircraft, you don't want to just chop the power when you see the destination, because that's going to cause fairly rapid cooling of the engine. Though in this particular case, this is an air-cooled engine, the Diamond DA42, so it's not quite as much of an issue. Plus, you can, since it's not a fixed pitch prop like on a 172, you can leave the power up. You don't have to pull the power back when you descend, unless, of course, you're encountering turbulence, in which case you will want to pull back the power. But you do at some point want to slow up before you reach this bottom of descent point 3 miles from the field, because frankly, on our descent, we're doing about 180 knots, and you don't want to be blasting into the traffic pattern at 180 knots. So at some point during the descent, you do need to pull the power back, so that in this case we could get the landing gear down, get below that landing gear extension speed, and also the flap extension speed as well. Now, by contrast, if you were straight into the runway from a high, fast descent and you don't slow up, you're probably going to end up with a high and fast unstable approach, which can have really huge consequences. So go ahead and grab your April issue of AOPA Pilot magazine, turn to page 20, and you can read my column there, which talks about the economics of unstable approaches. And I give 3 examples of pilots who spent a lot of money, or in one case paid the ultimate price, for their high, fast, and unstable approaches. Well, we arrived in Denton, Texas, and the next morning I spent about 3 hours giving ground instruction and also some flying time to the flight instructor of the new owner that was at U.S. Aviation Academy. He was a great young man. He's looking to join the airlines at some point in the future, and he certainly was having a lot of fun flying the DA42. I must say it's one sweet aircraft, and if you'd like to know more about that aircraft or you're thinking of buying one, go ahead and contact me, and I would be happy to help you with that purchase. And coming up next, a listener asked about picking up IFR clearances in the air, and an airline pilot responds to my article on how best to nail airspeed on final using pitch and power. We'll be right back. And I want to take just a moment to thank everybody for all the wonderful feedback you've given me, either through emails, Facebook comments, or iTunes reviews. Wow, you guys are great. Thank you so much. And we had 6 more reviews on iTunes this last week, and I didn't even say last week, please write a review. So a big thank you to these people for taking the time to write reviews. They include Pilot Bill, Electric Man Ken, New update is Bad MMK. That's quite an unusual name there. Riga Runner, BBT 95762, which I think is Brian's zip code. Buffalo Pilot, who is Mike. And I must say, some of these reviews are really long, so thanks so much for taking the time to write them. You all said such nice things, it was really hard to pick just one to read, but I'm going to pick this one from Brian, BBT 95762. His title is Awesome GA Podcast. He says, super happy with Max's podcast, very focused on the aspects of aviation that are important to me. GA single engine, piston, timely and relevant news, nice tips and tricks, and useful interviews. Keep up the good work, Max West. Thanks, Brian from Sacramento Executive Airport. And he calls me Max West because if you listen to me on the Airplane Geeks podcast, you know that my co-host Max is called Max East. He's back in Connecticut. So thanks so much for those reviews. And if you would, please share the podcast with an aviation friend or two. Have them come join us here. Okay, let's take a look at this first question that comes from Brian in Reston, Virginia. He says, if I'm departing an untowered airport such as Leesburg, which is KJYO in Virginia, in VFR conditions and have filed an IFR flight plan, is there a difference for ATC if I don't call clearance delivery on the radio, but instead depart VFR, stay under the Bravo, and contact Potomac departure on the radio to pick up my IFR clearance? We often experience long waits and or poor audio quality when calling Potomac clearance delivery via radio. Well, to answer your question specifically, no, there's not going to be any difference for ATC if you pick the clearance up in the air, but there's probably a big difference for you if you do. First of all, don't do this if there is poor weather in your area, because you're going to have to maintain VFR until you're able to get that clearance from ATC, and you can expect that there could be delays in the air, just as there are delays in the ground. There have been some accidents, including an FAA flight check jet in Georgia years ago, took off VFR, and before he was able to get his IFR clearance, he ended up in the clouds and slammed into a mountain down in Georgia. So this is can be dangerous if you've got clouds and any obstructions in the area that you can't see. So if you do depart VFR and you plan to get your clearance in the air, you're either going to have to remain in VMC conditions until you have received your clearance, or you're going to have to depart in uncontrolled IFR, that is down in Class G, and remain in Class G until you have your clearance. Now, in most places in the United States, that means you're going to stay below either 700 feet AGL or 1200 AGL in order to be in IMC without a clearance. Now, you could actually take off with no flight plan filed at all and do a pop-up clearance. Now, that's going to be a little bit more difficult. If you call ATC and request a pop-up clearance, they might send you first to flight service, where you'll have to first file your flight plan and then go back to ATC to get your clearance. But in your case, you talked about filing first and picking up in the air. In most cases, you'll be able to get that clearance from ATC, but expect some delays and stay clear of the mountains until you do get that clearance. And this letter comes from an airline pilot, somebody I've known for more than 10 years. He says, "Hi, Max. Thanks for doing this podcast. I'm really enjoying it. On a recent episode, you shared some valuable tips and techniques related to pitch and power control on final approach to landing. Since everything you shared is true, I certainly agree, but I also think it's important to add some more context. I came up with a nice little way to package this discussion several years ago, and I think it will be helpful to your listeners. It's a rule with 2 exceptions. The rule is pitch for altitude, power for airspeed." Now, first off, just let me add that that's different from what I said in my episode, but what I said was talking about flying on final, and that's one of the 2 exceptions he lists down below here. So Jim says the rule is pitch for altitude, power for airspeed, except for these two exceptions. Exception 1 is when the power is fixed, either maximum, such as in a full power climb, or minimum, such as an engine failure or gliding at idle. And exception 2 is when you are flying on the backside of the power curve. As you accurately stated, many small airplanes are designed to operate on the left side of the curve when on approach to landing. This means that a small change in angle of attack causes a very large change in induced drag. The result is it works best to make small pitch changes to cause changes in airspeed. We call this the area of reverse command because flying this way is reverse of the normal way of flying, e.g. the rule mentioned above. I feel strongly about pointing this out because I have seen many pilots over the years who start their instrument training and struggle with basic control performance techniques because they had pitch for airspeed and power for altitude drilled into their heads. Yes, that is how we do slow flight, exception number 2, and it's a good technique for some airplanes on final approach, also exception number 2. But it's important that pilots understand they are flying one of the exceptions in those situations. The normal way to fly an airplane is to pitch for altitude, including glide path, and power for airspeed. This is also important for anyone who plans to transition to turbine-powered aircraft. In the CRJs that I fly, we pitch for glide path and power for airspeed even on short final. Of course, as you also pointed out, pitch and power changes in any airplane affect each other, and what we are discussing here is simply the primary input that should be focused on in any given scenario. So once again, it's a rule with 2 exceptions. Learn the specific aerodynamics of your airplane and fly it accordingly. Hope this is helpful. Thanks again for all you do for our amazing industry. Sincerely, Jim. Well, Jim, thanks so much for writing and providing some additional context on the discussion on how to control airspeed on final. Well, that wraps it up for this week's edition of Aviation News Talk. You can find show notes at the website aviationnewstalk.com. Or if you're listening to the iPhone podcast app, just touch the cover artwork at the top of your display. You'll see the show notes, and there's a link there where you can click to record using your phone a listener question that I'll try to answer in a future show. Or you can just phone 650-967-2500 and leave your question. If you do, please leave your email address and your telephone in case I need to get back to you for some clarification. In the meantime, thanks so much for listening. Fly safely and keep the blue side up.